Okay, welcome to Seed Savers Exchange apple grafting. So excited to see you all here. Of course, this is kind of new to us. This is the first time we've done this virtually, but I'm really excited at the number of people that we're able to connect to this way. So we're going to get started this morning with a presentation about bench grafting. Our orchard manager, Lindsay Lee, is going to be giving that presentation, and I'll introduce him and a couple other people here in a minute. Before we do that, just a few kind of housekeeping things. As soon as we get started with this, I'm actually going to ask that everyone turn off both their video and their audio for the presentation, just so that Lindsay Lee is the one showing up on people's screens. Once he's done with that presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and I hope that you'll all turn your videos back on so we can see you. And when you have questions, turn the mic on so we can hear you. If you do have questions throughout the session, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll address those when we get to the Q&A as well. Let's see what else. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Janine Sheffert. I'm the Education and Engagement Manager here at Seed Savers Exchange. So I'm the one that you've probably received a couple emails from. I also want to introduce Jen Ripp. Jen, can you unmute and say hi for a second so everyone sees you?
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here and hope you're all really excited to start grafting.
So Jen is our assistant orchard manager, and she took the lead on creating all the kits that you guys received, which was a pretty giant job.
I don't know why your photo's not showing.
She'll be here throughout the duration, and we'll make sure you have her contact information as well, so you can keep in touch with her. We've also got Nathan. I'm not sure, I don't actually see your face up here, but he's running tech for us. So thanks to Nathan, we're gonna have some tech help. And of course, we have Lindsay Lee. I will introduce him in a minute, but before we do that, I also am just going to give you a little warning about the knife. As you all probably could guess, these knives are really sharp. It's easy to cut yourself. We will be going through the how-tos, kind of best knife practices. And so we recommend that you don't start practicing until after the presentation. You know, there's no guarantee that you won't cut yourself, but if you hear all about it and get these pointers, you'll know how best to do it. In the case that you do hurt yourself, please make sure you address that, assess it, and address it. And this will all be recorded, so you'll have this available. So again, just be really careful with those knives. They're really sharp. Let's see what else. I think that's about it. So we're going to do this presentation again after that. During the presentation, I'll have you turn off your cameras. After that, we'll have the Q&A, where we hope you have questions we can answer, and then we'll have a little bit of time after that to actually get out your knives, your scion, your practice wood, and actually start practicing, and we can take questions there too. This is a large group. Most of you are also signed up for small groups, and we'll see you and work with you more individually in those smaller sessions too. So with that, let me introduce Lindsay Lee. Lindsay is our orchard manager here at Seed Savers Exchange. We're really lucky to have him here, not only for this session, but here at Seed Savers. He was actually one of the 3 people who planted the historic orchard here at Seed Savers. And so he's been connected to these trees for a long time and working with plants and trees for many, many years. So we're excited to have him here. Lindsay Lee, I am going to turn it over to you.
Good morning. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here and helping us see if we can do this on a virtual platform. So we've taught this class in person here. I'm in the basement of an old barn, an old dairy barn here on the Seed Saver campus. And we have gathered groups of 20 in here every spring for grafting lessons that we, good heavens, many years, decades of experience teaching grafting, but now this is a new deal. So bear with us, pay attention. We're going to try to give you a very specific set of instructions so that you can do have the best chance of success possible. Grafting is not well, I've often called it live carpentry, and it's kind of a hybrid between whittling and horticulture. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here and go through some slides with you and explain what we're talking about. First of all, orcharding is a really enjoyable experience. It's not an immediate gratification thing. So a tree like this might be 10 years old, and it takes time, and year to year things change. You need to kind of keep aware of the environment and the changes. This year in Northeast Iowa, we've had a week and a half of really warm temperatures, and our trees are leafing out, and that might be, good heavens, I think, just as my memory serves me, might be 2 weeks early, at least a week. So, but it's not, it's a lot of fun, but it's something you really need to pay attention to. But it's really also incredibly rewarding. If you dream of this kind of thing, of baskets full of apples, before long, you can have that. You can have more apples than you know what to do with. This morning, I chopped an apple up into my oatmeal, and it's entirely possible to keep a storage apple through the winter until, I had them last year until the 1st of May with good storage and the right variety. So apples are an amazing fruit. We have summer apples that you want to make right into sauce. We have dessert and baking and cider and storage and drying apples, and you name it. It's an incredibly versatile fruit. Oh yes, that oatmeal this morning I sweetened with a little, tablespoon of boiled cider, a cider syrup that's made just like maple syrup, boiling down sap or cider. So here's what we're doing. That is a graft union before it's been taped shut, and my thumb and forefinger there are holding it shut. But what we want in the end is a nice tight fit. This is a skill. It's any activity like this improves with practice, and this is why we put some practice wood in your kits. They're the pieces that are loose in your cyan wood wrap, and they have been sprayed with a little dusting of orange paint just to identify them as your practice wood. They're unknown, they're apple wood, but they're unknown varieties of apple wood. So you'll get to practice on those. If you want more practice, go for it. You could go to the yard and good heavens, cut a piece of pussy willow or dogwood, or let's see what else. Lilac would be a little tougher, but things like forsythia, and just look at your shrubbery and look for wood. Maybe you have other fruit trees and you can take shoots off of those and practice with, because it's the more you do this, the better you get. When I sit down to do a bunch of grafts this spring, yet by the 4th or 5th one, I'll be making cuts cleanly in 1 or 2 strokes, and you can move right along. But speed isn't the objective in this first grafts you make. Why do we graft apples? This is your big fat word for the day, and heterogosity is the tendency of a plant to not pollinate itself. That prefix hetero is just like heterosexuality in humans. They cannot fertilize themselves. So therefore we have to use vegetative means. And that means we, generally horticulturally, you could use cuttings, stick cuttings, hardwood cuttings work on a variety of shrubs and trees, but what's borne out is that apple trees don't root that readily. So grafting is a way to increase your odds, your percentages. There's other methods of vegetative reproduction like tissue culture. That's a little front end input heavy. And there's layering. These are all methods of making plants grow roots. The whole idea that they do not produce their own likeness through seed is here. This is a apple flower, and notice the 5 petals. These are related to here. These out here, the stamens, that's got the pollen on it, and the stigma are back in here, and there's 5 of them, lo and behold. And each of those compartments holds a couple of seeds each. So each apple, mostly they produce 10 seeds per year in that big fruit. And that every one of those 10 seeds is going to produce a different kind of tree. They may have, just like our own offspring, they may have similarities, but they're going to be different. There are places like, locally, the University of Minnesota produces, they run a breeding program, so they can do controlled crosses where they know what pollen they're using in what flower, and they increase their chances of a good fruit by doing that. But otherwise, the chances are strong that this fruit out of our orchard was pollinated by a crabapple, and that might make it a little smaller, might make it a little more bitter. Who knows? It all depends on where the particular grain of pollen came from that fertilized that individual seed. And there's a saying, an adage that says, in every fruit, there's an orchard. And that's to say that in this bowl of apples, there's many, many different looking trees. And this is an interesting connection to American history, I think. We've all heard of Johnny Appleseed, and he didn't necessarily believe in grafting. He had ideas that nature had its own methods, and so he collected seeds, and he went out ahead of the westward expansion of the Europeans in this continent and planted seedling orchards. And then to fulfill requirement of homesteading, the homesteaders would plant trees as improvements, which were required by the law. And he just kind of made profit from that and did very well with it. But what he also did was spread genetic variation all over the eastern United States. And it's through that spread and other people carrying seed. I know some European immigrants brought seed with them from Europe. We have an incredible diversity of apples available to us, and some of it's because of all this seed propagation. Our collection here in Decorah, Iowa has right now, I don't know, somewhere around 1,200 varieties. That's a small portion of what the number of varieties that actually exist today. Though the overall variety of named apple varieties has greatly diminished in the last several decades, because our commercial orchards are focusing on fewer and fewer varieties, and it's just a matter of choice, I think. But we owe the diversity we see in the heritage apples to the seed generation. For an example, this is a neighbor of ours, and he's an avid hunter of wild apples. And he came, we have a local fruit growers organization, and he came to one of our meetings one night, and he had 40 varieties off of fence row and pasture trees that were unnamed. And these are all ones that he's tasted and determined to have merit, either for just eating, saucing, or cider. And we had quite a tasting with these, and most of these came from a pasture that's full of wild trees. And it's a fascinating experiment. Some of them are just horrible. I stop myself along the roadside once in a while and taste an apple that's in the fence row, and you never know what you'll get. Some of them are sweet as can be. Some of them are what we call spitters, that you would immediately spit that out. And so there's, and you know, the thing is, if you tasted one of these and it was the best thing you've ever had, you could graft that tree. And if it's truly an unknown strain, well, then you if you want to share it with your neighbors, you can name it or not. You could put a number on it even, and make more copies of it and share it around. This man you see in the photo did introduce one variety, one apple that he named. He found it in a fence row, and area cider makers, cideries have started growing that pretty commonly, because it's got a really nice high tannin and acidic quality to it. And so be careful you get involved in this, and you better have some space, because this hobby takes some space. Here's another example of variety. These are out of our orchard here, and good heavens, they go from flat to conical, from yellow skin to red skin, russets. One of my favorite groups are russets. They have kind of a potato-looking skin, and are really pretty resistant to insect and disease problems, and are most often very, very flavorful. Years ago, I made a whole batch of cider purely from golden russets that were dead ripe, and it was almost too sweet to drink straight. We would blend it in order to make it palatable, because it was viscous and sugary. So, okay, so grafting, what we're doing now in this workshop is bench grafting, and it's done in the dormant season. So here's a tree that's leafless, and like I said, our trees are just now starting to bud out, but I was out this morning and was able to nab a few stems that hadn't leafed out yet. So this is what we're collecting from. Here's a little video I'll have you watch about that process. Do it. Janine, I think you have to start that. So I'm out here in the orchard today, and we're going to collect scion wood. That's the grafting material off of this tree, so we get a copy of the same tree. It's late February today. This is kind of the time frame. The wood has to still be dormant to do this grafting properly. So in Iowa here, we do it February, March, sometimes into April. The critical part is you have to have a few weeks for the graft union to heal a little bit before you plant it out in the garden, and that's going to be around your frost-free date. So you can work back from there. Okay, I'm standing here in a rather old tree, and I want to show you some different parts of the tree. If you look up here, I've got a stem that is it's old growth. There's flower buds all over it, and there's very little new growth. We have to do our grafting with young, new growth. So there's nothing on this branch that would help us. Now, on an old tree like this, I often look back in the middle of it, and here I find a shoot that's vigorous and upright. Some people call them sucker shoots or water shoots. This one actually has a couple years growth on it, and I'll show you that. It came from this part of the tree. Here's actually 3-year-old wood. It's got spurs on it, and those hold flower buds, and we do not want our new graft to sprout out with flowers. We want leaves. Here's another section of new growth from last year. Well, it'd be from 2 years ago. And now here, I'm going to take this off. Right here is last year's terminal bud scar, and this shoot came out last summer. And that's what we want. It's brighter red. Sometimes they're yellowish, but often reddish. It's smooth, kind of glossy, and out toward the tip a little bit fuzzy growth. So that's what I'm looking for. Now, the size of the wood I want is determined a little bit by the rootstock I'm going to put this on, and it's really wonderful to match the diameter of your rootstock with the diameter of the scionwood. You can use scionwood that's smaller than your rootstock, but you can't use scionwood that's larger than your rootstock. For this workshop coming up, you're going to have rootstocks that are measured at 1/4 inch. So I'm going to take this whole cutting here, and I can make a new tree out of every 2-inch section of this. But just so I can store it easily, I'm going to cut it in half. And I'm going to put these in a plastic bag wrapped in damp, not wet, but damp paper towel. And I can store this in the refrigerator anywhere a few degrees above freezing, like 34 to 42, something like that is wonderful for it, and I can store it for weeks that way. Okay, so just to reiterate that, share screen. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Nathan. I'm really good with trees. I'm not really good with these computers. So here's a shot. These buds that are on little stems, those are spurs. They're always going to be flowering buds. Here's a bud right here that is standing out proud from the stem just a little bit, and that's probably still flower. But above that, these all look good. This whole stem looks good. This piece right there looks good. So that's what we're shopping for when we're out in a tree. Sometimes an old tree, you want to save grandma's old tree, doesn't put out a lot of new growth in a year. And you might want, you want to look up high in the center of the tree. That's where most of the new growth is going to go. You can use the water shoots. They're the same genetic material. Be careful not to take wood from down within a foot of the ground, because if it's a grafted tree, you could be taking shoots that are from the rootstock. So that's just a general rule on most all trees. And yeah, you can collect them early. There are organizations around of fruit collectors that stick these things in the mail regularly and send them hither and yon. So we do not want this to happen when we make a graft. We don't want flowers, because that flower pulls a lot of energy and will not, it wants to make fruit. It does not want to make a bunch of leaf. If this happens, nip the flowers off below the ovary, and it may make leaf, but quite often, more often than not, they just subside and don't succeed. But so you want to be careful to get those vegetative buds rather than the big fat flower buds. In your kit, you got rootstocks. These are of known properties. So there are named varieties of rootstocks, just like there are apples. Most of these are produced by breeding programs that are trying to promote one quality or another. The M7s that you got, that stands for EMLA, East Malling Long Ashton research stations, both combined and bred this. There's quite a number of M series rootstocks, and M7 produces a tree that's considered 50% the size of standard. We can't say it produces a 10-foot tree or 15-foot tree, because all varieties of apples have different vigor, different growth rates. And so we say it's 50% of what the tree would ordinarily be. They're produced vegetatively. This is a stool block, and these, you'll see on the bottom end, this has been cut off of a stump, and they basically grow a patch of coppice and mound soil around the base, and the roots grow out into that, and then they go along and cut those off. And you got a known stem with roots on it. So here's a little chart. It's certainly not all of them, but the M's are, this East Malling. G's are from Geneva, from the US. But there's, you can kind of choose the size of tree you want to produce. Buds refer to Budnowski. That's a Polish kind, and this one's a very popular dwarf tree. Anything smaller than M7 needs to have support. You simply have an inferior root system to produce a smaller tree. And so anytime we get smaller than an M7, and sometimes even an M7 in certain soils, might want to have support to it, but M7 is what we're using today. The knife is a specialized tool for bench grafting. It's flat. It's sharpened like a chisel, so it's absolutely flat on one side, and then has a bevel on the other. This knife is mine, and it has a bud grafting knife on the other end, and that's sharpened with a bevel on both sides, so they're quite different. And the reason being, that flat side, that chisel edge, we're trying to make a really smooth, clean cut. No rippling in it, and this facilitates that. It is, I'll mention again, a very sharp tool and needs to be handled with respect. In our in-person classes, we don't even pass them out until it's time to graft, so we can avoid a nick or two. So this is the best thing to use. I have seen people do this with bi-bevel knives, but it's easier with this type of knife. With that, this video will take you through the whole grafting sequence, and this is the time to really pay attention. And the beauty of this format is that you'll be able to tune in and watch it over and over if you need to. So here you go. We're ready to make our graft union. This is a piece of cyan wood that came in your kit. Look at the buds. They're triangular in shape and they should point up. It's very important. If we put this on upside down, it won't grow. So those buds have to be pointing away from the rootstock. This is your grafting knife, and it's a very sharp implement. And I'm going to teach you how to use it where it would be really hard to cut yourself. That's something we really want to avoid today. It has a flat side and a beveled side. The flat side should be facing you as if you're looking in a hand mirror. I'm going to put my thumb right against the blade. From the side, that's not ever going to cut me. No matter how, it's when I move back and forth against that blade that I'll cut myself. We've provided in your kit a little thumb cot that's a protector. It's not absolute, but it'll help prevent cuts. I find that when I do a lot of this, I whittle away at my thumb a little bit. So this would be nice to keep a little skin left on. Okay, so to make the cut, keep your elbows fastened to your body. The less we have movement in our hands, the more accurate we'll be. If I do this work out away from my body, I have less control. There's more movement. Right up here, I have the most control and the most power that I can put into this cut. So to make it, put your thumb here. Now put the scion wood in between the thumb and the knife. I tilt the knife a little bit and then angle it. The angle there is going to determine the angle you go through the wood. Now, the trick is, don't move your dominant hand that's holding the knife. Move the hand that's holding the scion wood. Okay? Now I just pulled a little bark off there. I might put the knife at a little more angle and a little more force with my thumb and pull that wood through. And look, all my thumb is doing is coming in to rest against the side of the blade. Now, common mistakes, if you're afraid of that blade and you don't put your thumb there, you're going to get a little tongue on the end of this. That's not good. That is too thin. I really want a flat surface all the way to the tip. And I want a flat surface this way too. If we've whittled away at it and we have something that looks like a potato chip, it's not going to come in good contact with the rootstock. So we want very flat surfaces. We also want them to be 3 times the diameter of the wood long. You see that? This is just a scrap of scion wood, and this is at least 3 times the diameter, and it can be more than, shouldn't be less. The reason being is when we fasten this to the rootstock, we wrap tape around it, and we want it to pull them together. If I have too sharp an angle, it'll push them apart. You'll see that later. Okay, this is a good cut. The next thing is to cut the rootstock. The diameters, the whip and tongue graft is used on rootstock and scion woods that match in diameter. So you see here, I'm a good 10 inches up from the root, and that's okay. But right in here, I'm going to make my cut on the rootstock. That's a little short, not a problem. If I just come back here and peel away at the heel and do a little whittling, I can end up with a nice, flat, even taper. So I've got those both the same length, and we judged them to be the same width to begin with, so I think they're going to fit together quite nicely. We can be a little bit undersized with the scion wood. We cannot be oversized with it. If it hangs out the edges, it won't take. The next thing, we call this a whip and tongue graft. The next step is the tongue cut. What I do for this, I set this on the table for this maneuver, and I use my knife to visualize center. Then I move back about 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 even. And I like to just wiggle the knife and apply some sideways pressure. Now this is counterintuitive to a lot of people because look, my fingers are here and I'm pushing that way. So be careful, push a little pressure, and then when you're in a ways, pull that up and open this cut. Can you see that from the side? It's ready to receive its pairing. So we do the same thing on the rootstock. I find center, I move out a little bit. And I'm trying here not to split with the grain. I am cutting back into the wood. So I've got 2 tongue cuts made opposite each other. I can fit those together, push them together, and there we have a graft union that will grow together. The more closely these fit, the more closely they align, the higher percentage of take you're going to have. So practice a little bit, use up that practice wood we sent along, get good at this cut, and you'll be able to make graft unions with the pros. The next step is to wrap it in your kit. Some of this tape came. This is a stretchy paraffin-based, wax-based tape, and you simply hold it on your rootstock with a finger, stretch it, and once it's trapped, once you've gone once around, you can really stretch this out and wrap and pull that really tight. Once I've gone over the whole graft, I turn it around, come back down, and before you're done, before you lose a little bit to work with, I pull it tight and rip the end off. What that does is seals it against itself. It's waxy, so it kind of sticks to itself. Now, I've got a bud here and a bud here. I don't need more than that on there, so I'm going to take that off. Cut it just, 1/8, 1/4 inch above the top bud. When these start to grow, there's even one here, 2, 3 buds on there. That's plenty. You're going to end up choosing one of them. But there you have a whip and tongue graft. Now, we're going to go on. Maybe I have rootstock or scion wood that's too small for the rootstock I have. So here I have a nice big fat rootstock. There's a couple little twigs on there. And for this, so there's no place on here where I can line this up that the two are the same size. So I'm going to choose the place I want to put it. That's up about 8-10 inches from the root. And I cut that off square. Next, I'm going to make the cut on the scion wood first because I need to know how long it is. Okay, so here we go. See, I didn't have pressure behind here, so I have a tail. I take that off. Let's make one more. Oh. Yeah, nice and flat. Okay, this one I still make a tongue cut. Open it up. Now, by simply holding these side by side, I can tell how long this cut needs to be. And using the other side of the knife, the tapered side now down, I slice this off until I get the same width as my scion wood. Okay, I've got that. Again, I find center. I go back just a little bit. I make that tongue cut. And slide them together. The tongue cut is really there to keep those two hanging on to each other until I get the wrapper on. How's that? So again, it's a nice tight fit. The only difference is I have this stump end. We'll be able to cover that with the wrapping tape. It's called budding tape, but we use it in the summer for bud grafting. So again, stretch this out and trap the first tail of it and keep wrapping, pulling it tight, stretching out the wrapper. Oh, I tore it a little bit, but then I'm going back down over myself and then break it off. This kind of seals up the end of that stump. And there you go. You have a side graft tree as well as the whip and tongue. Okay? Do I need to share screen again? Okay. Was that clear to everybody? Or clear as mud? This is a little line drawing, illustrating just a few things. Again, this cut needs to be very clean, very smooth. The tongue cut comes back up in here, and it's, like I said, it's just a little bit off center, and it goes about so deep. I'd say a 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch deep. When you make this cut, I always like to look at it from this direction, straight down at the face of the cut, and you'll want to see a bark layer all the way around it. If this is a blunt end, you're not going to see that bark from this direction, meaning your tip is not complete. You know, you might have the end of the stick right here, but you want this to come down to a clean point, and then you should be able to see the bark all the way around. The green layer right inside the bark is the cambium, and that's the real deal. That's where new growth is going to happen. So when we line the cyanwood and the rootstock up, those two cambium layers from the two parts are going to be held tightly face to face. What happens here is that callus tissue forms. You could cut the end of the cyanwood piece and wrap it in damp paper and put it in the fridge for a month and take it out. You'd probably have callus tissue at the end of it. Well, when they're pressed together, that callus tissue grows together and becomes one. It's not until all the voids in that union are filled with callus tissue that the cells differentiate and form vascules and allow the flow of sap up that tree. That I call that when the magic happens. So, and then again, this cut, the taper of this cut should be 3, and actually I'd say 3 to 5 times the diameter of the stick long. Okay. On the side graft, it's very much the same thing. Because you're just sliping the side of the stick off, the deeper you go, the wider that cut becomes. So you can have a lot of control over how to match the cyanwood with the rootstock. You'll find that the cambium layer, when you just slice off the side of that rootstock, is pretty wide. You've got a wide stretch of cambium layer that's exposed, so it's easy to hit it. The right side of this shows possibly some cambium layer exposed. I really want the edge of the cyanwood the bark layer of the cyanwood to line up with the bark layer of the rootstock. When you're done, when you've got your grafts done, actually, as you do them, when you get one done, I have right at my side here a bucket of water, and I have my rootstock sitting in that. And that's where I'll put my newly done trees in. Once I'm done, I'm going to take the sphagnum moss that they were packed in originally. And if there's not enough, a little damp shredded newspaper would work. These packing materials, you want to wring them out. Take a wad of it in your hands and just squeeze it out so that it's not dripping with moisture. I don't want any pool of water in the bottom of the bag here. But the reason we're doing this, and you've got an instruction sheet that was sent to you, but the reason we're wrapping these back up in plastic is that we'd like them to stay moist. And the tips, the newly grafted tips are up here, and they don't need to be wrapped in sphagnum, but they should be humid. That's why if there's enough bag, I bring the bag over the top and tie it on. If there's not enough bag, I might get a second bag and bring it down over the top. But this makes a little humid environment for them to be in. And then it's the temperature thing that you want to pay attention to. A refrigerator works. I use a root cellar at home that's cool and damp. Well pits, garages, depends on where you live and what the temperatures are, but you really want something between 34 and I don't know what my sheet says, 45, somewhere in there. The warmer it is, the quicker it's going to heal. The cooler it is, the longer it's going to take. But you want to condition these trees in that setting for 10 days, 2 weeks. You check them now and then if you want. You don't want to be seeing any mold in there. And at the time you take them out, when they're ready to go, this has got the budding tape still on up to this point, but you can see callus tissue here. It's a creamy colored growth that's filled those cracks. There's the tongue cut. Oop. I'll go back. This is the vein cut, and then the tongue comes down here, and it's full of callus tissue. You can see on this one, a bud has started to swell, and this tree is ready to go out into the garden. I really recommend you put these in the edge of the garden first for the first year or two, just because you'll need to tend these weekly or so. And if you put them out way out in the orchard, you might not think of them. I want them in your garden where you're seeing them every day when you go out to harvest dinner. What'll happen is they'll start to grow, and there will be buds shoot out all up and down. Those that grow below the rootstock or below the graft union, sorry, the rootstock shoots all come off, no questions, immediately. They are taking energy away from this part. This is your cyanwood that's on top. Eventually, I'm going to select the strongest shoot from the cyanwood part and take off everything else. I want to put all the energy this tree has to give out one shoot. And at this stage, when these things are tender, you don't need to run back and get a clipper. You can just push it sideways with your thumb. I find that when you push sideways, it lessens the tendency to tear bark. And you just hold that tree and push sideways with your thumb, and those tender shoots will come off. Here's one that is ready to plant out, though I still have to reduce the shoots. This budding tape can stay on. In fact, a bud will often grow right out through it. But you don't need to worry about taking that off. It will degrade sometime in the first summer out in the garden. It'll deteriorate and blow away. Here's one that's had maybe a month of growth. And here's a little nursery trick I do when there's some tape here. When I select the bud, I often select the lowest bud on here, and I'll leave a little stump. And that allows me to gently pull that upright and tape it. It just makes it so that my tree is more in line. It'll grow fine without that, but you'll end up having your bud shoot sweeping out of the rootstock. And if that doesn't bother you, it wouldn't bother me either. But since I have a nursery background and I want a tree that's pretty straight, I tape them up. I think you can see in the background here is one kind of sticking off to the side, and that's, you know, just a little bit less desirable. So do this if you want. Masking tape would work. This is a little stretchy tape, but anything that will expand a little bit or degrade, so that you don't want wire and stuff like that won't degrade, so that when this grows big, it'll cut itself off. So, and then this is something I cannot stress enough, is when you get to the first fall, you need to protect these trees. So this is a little patch at my home, and you see I've got chicken wire buried in the ground so the rabbits don't dig under it. And this is high enough that the deer don't jump into it. And then the individual trees are wrapped in order to keep the mice. And that wrapper too is buried in the soil. This is, I find, a really cheap way to do it, though it takes a little time. I take the paper wrapper, the tree wrap, and I fold it and staple it up the tree. So you've got a very low input tree wrap. There are other options. There's those white spirals that work quite well, and we find they're reusable. We save them and use them year after year. There are grow tubes that foresters use, and we use just that first year 12, 18-inch one would work. But one way or another, if you don't, you need to protect these trees, because the mice, the rodents, the rabbits, the deer, they all want to eat it. So if you don't protect it, you won't have it next spring, at least in this part of the world. So here's a healed bench graft at the end of the first summer. The callus tissue is turning into bark, and that's kind of that's our goal. That's what we're after. This is a tree that's a number of years old. There's still a bulge down here. Can't see it because of the weeds, but it's the graft union is still visible on most trees, and you're on your way to growing an orchard, and you're on your way to having boatloads of fruit. How are we doing?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lindsay. Are you ready for Q&A?
I think so.
Okay. So thank you so much for that presentation. We have lots of really great questions already coming in, and we'll go through those now. If you all want to turn your videos back on, I welcome you to do that. It's really great to see your faces. There's a couple different ways to ask questions. There have been some questions that are coming through as Lindsay's giving the talk, and I will ask those here. There have been a few questions about the kind of later caring for the trees, protecting them, and we'll get further into that this afternoon. So I'm going to skip those questions for this morning. That's going to be the focus of our afternoon session, but we'll get questions about the grafting this morning. So there's two ways to ask questions here. One is to write the questions in the chat box, and I will read them to Lindsay. The other one is if you want to be the one asking the question, in your lower right hand corner of your screen, you'll see a button that says reactions. If you press that, there's a button that says raise hand. And if you do that, I'll know that you have a question. We can call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. So Lindsay, I'm just going to dive into some of these questions that were coming through, if that works for you. And kind of in order of your presentation, Alexis asked, I know that this workshop is specific to apples, but could you talk about if there are differences to consider, or if it's the same process if you're doing grafting with other trees, such as stone fruits?
Yes, and it is, I know less about that. I have done grafting with pears. I've done grafting with shade trees. I worked in a wholesale nursery where we grafted, like seedless silver maples and ash trees and different strains of maples and whatnot. So you need to use the same genus, so Malus is apple, and they wouldn't work on a pear root. They wouldn't work on a stone fruit root. So you need to stay within the genus. So in stone fruit, Prunus would be the genus, and so I think, I've not done stone fruit, but I think the same roots would work for like plums and cherries and stuff like that. But you should do a little research on that first. But I know there are walnut strains that are grafted, but you can't stick these things on other genuses, with a few exceptions. There are some genuses that are close enough to each other. I know sometimes they use a quince root to get a dwarf pear. But other than that, we get very far away from apples and shade trees. You're outside my experience.
I have another question that's come in about using different varieties of apples on the same tree. Can you use this type of graft to do that? Yeah,
this is a very common question. I think we get it almost every year because people have seen the 3-in-1 and 4-in-1 apples in the catalogs. And absolutely it can be done, though you kind of got to know what you're doing. I said earlier, talking about the rootstocks, that all these varieties have different growth rates. So you better know your trees pretty well, because if you put, say, around here, there's a lot of Melindas and they grow like wildfire. And if I put that on a tree that's not got a vigorous growth rate, you're going to have one lopsided tree, or you're going to do a lot of trimming on the one side of it, one way or the other. So the varieties that go onto those 3-in-1s are carefully selected because they all have the same vigor. As long as we're on that subject, there's another, this might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but there's a term called interstem. The rootstock, besides size, can impart other qualities like disease resistance. And if you read about the different rootstocks, you'll learn those things very quickly, like fire blight resistance and resistance to woolly aphid and whatnot. So you can add other qualities to your tree by grafting an interstem, which is another type of tree in between, another apple variety in between the rootstock and your desired fruiting cyanwood. And that may be a way to get, I don't know, more fire blight resistance. Usually an interstem is used for disease resistance qualities. But
right.
Yeah.
Thank you. There was a comment also earlier, you had said that the trees at the roadside are spitters, you called them. And Janet is wondering if that is because they're high tannin apples, and would that make them good for hard cider?
Absolutely. Yes. In cider making, you want the two, sweetness, sugars turn into alcohol and really don't affect the flavor much at all. So in hard cider making, we're looking for acidity and tannic content. So those two qualities survive fermentation and make more interesting cider. If you have just a sweet apple juice that you ferment, you're going to get alcohol and a pretty flat tasting product.
Great. We have a lot of questions here. Actually, before I get to that, Jen, we have a question about the different Scion varieties in the kits that were sent out. Do you want to take a minute to just briefly discuss those?
Yeah, sure. So the mission of Seed Savers is to have the ability to get as many of the varieties that we have here out into people's gardens. And we looked at this as a great opportunity to keep some of these really, really awesome varieties alive and going. And once your grafts are all successful, which they will be, we'll be able to know kind of where these trees are and just have people enjoy them. So we decided that we wanted to do kind of the more specific to cider versus what we call like a dessert or a fresh eating apple, also a cooking apple. So as Lindsay was talking about, the flavor profiles are going to be a little different in that. And the varieties chosen were kind of based off of these really big, beautiful standard sized trees that we have here that have enough scion wood to get out to 200 participants. And they happen to also be the trees that kind of the orchard was founded on. So these are ones that Lindsay grafted back in 1989. And they're still growing and they're still beautiful. If there's any specific questions about varieties, I'll have my email up and you're welcome to chat me. Most of them are local to local-ish for the Midwest and Upper Midwest. And yeah, they should grow great where you are at. We specialize mostly in trees that are 1900 and before, so kind of before the commercialized apple varieties came into being, and kind of more or less made these disappear into the past. And so reviving them is really awesome. And thank you all for being variety stewards.
Great, thank you, Jen. Lindsay, we have quite a few questions about rootstock. Could you talk about where rootstock comes from in terms of the plant, whether a person could propagate their own rootstock and how to get more rootstock and things like that?
Okay, rootstock's pretty easily available through mail order catalogs. I probably shouldn't name any, but they're pretty easy to find if you search for apple rootstock. You're gonna get nurseries that have that. As an aside to that, as part of that, Seed Savers Exchange, one of the things we do here is publish nursery, what's it called? Nursery trade inventory. And it basically is a resource book that allows you to look at what nurseries are producing fruit trees, as at least part of it is fruit trees. And there's a lot of apple rootstock listed in there, and there's a code that you can look up and see what nurseries are retail, what nurseries are wholesale, and so on. So that might be a fun thing to get a hold of. It's available through the Seed Saver catalog.
Yeah.
You can grow your own. If you say you have a tree that you've planted, even one of these today, if it doesn't take, you could let it grow. And you know what the word coppice is? The practice of coppicing a plant. Many of us do it unknowingly when we lop off a weed tree like a box elder or something in the garden. And what happens? They just grow back with 3 stems instead of 1. And that's called coppicing. You can cut annually, and they just get to be bushier and bushier. So what you do is establish the plant. I would grow it on for a year or 2, and then I'd cut it off with a few inches of stub one spring, and that stub is going to grow shoots. And when those shoots get over 10 inches tall, I would take a nice rich composty soil mix and heap it around the plant. And at home, to do this, commercially, the big growers out in the Northwest do just acres and acres and acres of these things, and they do it quite mechanically. But as a home gardener, I can do that. And what I found worked nicely, I took a big, like a 5-gallon nursery container pot, those black pots, and I cut the bottom out of it, turned it upside down, and I filled that with my compost and soil mix. And that, just made it so I didn't have have to have quite so much material to cover the stems. You leave the tops of the stems out and they grow on for the rest of the summer. And during that time, they grow roots out into that soil mix. Come fall, I can remove that pot and my pile of soil and pull it away and expose those roots, and right down near the soil where those stems started, I can cut those off. And I did this years ago. I haven't got a school working now, but I would produce 10 or 15 stems a year, and good heavens, that's plenty. Plenty to play with. If you want more than that, if you get to where you're needing hundreds, the wholesale growers will sell hundreds to you, and they're really very inexpensive because they're so grown in such mass quantities. Is there more about rootstocks there? I mean, the variety.
Yeah,
of
that
rootstock is huge. There's lots of different types you can get.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit about what let's see, what was it? What factors of the tree come from the rootstock versus come from the scion wood?
Okay, the qualities from the rootstock are going to be the size. Most importantly is the size of the tree. Now, all these varieties of rootstock then have other issues that they bring to the table, and a big one is some of it is soil adaptability. Some of them say they're better in drier soils. Some say they're better in wetter soils. I would, and some, depending on where you are, if fire blight's a problem, there's some, especially these Geneva ones are quite well respected for their resistance to fire blight. Yeah, that's most of it. The size thing, and there's really a revolution going on in commercial orcharding right now, because we've got some really good rootstocks that are very hardy, that are really dwarf, that produce trees that are maybe 8 feet tall, and those are now being grown on trellises, basically kind of a wall of apple tree. So in the aisles, anything sticking into the aisle is pruned off, and so that you end up with this flat plane of trees, and they're planted very densely. What an old standard tree we used to put, I have my own orchard, I have some trees on Antonovka, which grows a full-size tree. And if I let it grow as tall as it wants, it could be 40 feet tall. So you basically have a shade tree with fruit. if I plant Antonovkas 40 feet apart, that gives me enough room to put about 40 trees on an acre of land. Now, with modern dwarf tree culture on these small ones, anything smaller than M7, than 50% needs to be supported. So we grow them on trellises, and some people are planting, good heavens, 1,500 trees per acre now. I've seen things, articles about 2,000 trees per acre. We've started a trellis section here to grow some of our backups on, and those we're going to plant 3 feet apart in the row, and the rows are 12 feet apart, so we can get equipment through there. The cyanwood qualities are, like I talked about before, they're all over the map. You know, there's little rock hard crab apples, and usually it's those, you know, there's a lot of crabs that we use in cidering. It's just, it fascinates me, and the whole idea of, you know, I think what really has given apple diversity a blow is that we've got this thing called global trade and refrigerated transportation. And that is just, you know, made the world a difference, because we can be eating apples today from the grocery store that were grown in New Zealand or anywhere on the planet, because they're using varieties that keep exceedingly well, and they have really high-tech storage systems down. And so we don't anymore need a storage apple that we can put in our root cellars and enjoy at Christmas time. There are apples in our collection here that literally are not very edible until Christmas. But we have a hard freeze that would ruin them, you know, by October. So we put them in the root cellar. I wrap them in newsprint, and then we start taking them out around the holidays, and they have fully ripened at that point. That said, on the other end of the spectrum, we have an apple here in the collection that is usually ripe by the end of July. Well, if I can store an apple until May, and then they'll only have to wait till the end of July for fresh fruit, that's a lot of the year that the apple takes care of. And it's lucky that in that time frame, we happen to have strawberries and raspberries and currants and stuff like that to feast on.
So I'm going to interrupt for a second. I know we have promised to answer questions and promised to graft together here. We only have about 14 minutes left. So I'm going to just put this poll out. You can all kind of anonymously vote on which one you want me to prioritize. Meanwhile, I'm going to ask a couple more questions while this poll is going on. It's really like 50-50 right now. So there's a question about, you described the knife and then described that it's different, knives are different. Could you go over that again, just talking about the flat side and why that's important?
I'm going to switch camera views here, I think. Okay, there's my lap, and here's the knife. So how is this best to see?
Yeah, I think we can
learning
see
where the camera's looking at.
Maybe a little further away it can.
And they get a shine. But anyway, yeah, let's do it this way. No, this side of the knife is flat as can be. In fact, I'll show you something here. I've got a sharpening stone along. This side has the bevel. So think of a chisel. It is flat on one side and a bevel on the other. Many of you have purchased knives through this kit. And let me adjust this a little bit. And you're going to need to know how to maintain them. So here I have a set of 3 diamond stones. Could be a Japanese whetstone, any stone would work, but you want some pretty fine textures. This is actually coarse, no, medium coarse, medium fine and extra fine. I would only use this, I can feel a little texture on this stone. I would only use that if I put a big nick in it and I needed to kind of start over. So I'm going to put that away. This one is called fine. It's probably about a, I don't know, 800 to 1,000 grit. It still feels a little rough in there, but today my knife is pretty sharp. I'm not even going to use that today. This one is extra fine. And so these are water stones. You want them to be wet. All stones you use wet, whether it's water or oil. If it says on it that it's an oil stone, you want to use oil. Otherwise, it's pretty much a water thing. So I put the beveled side down and tilt this up tilt the blade up until you can kind of feel where the edge is. It's not very much. A grafting knife has a very sharp angle. I'm going to try something here. Speaking of angles, I'm going to move this camera again. Is that better? Okay,
That's fine.
so I'm just going to tip it up maybe 15 degrees at the most and push. And I'm using my arm in a very mechanical way. So I keep that angle that I'm pushing the blade across the stone as similar, as uniform as I can. And you start to see little dark particles in the water here. And that means you're grinding the knife blade a little bit. On the back side, on the flat part, you can put this down and just, I'm wiggling the table. You see the dark material in there? That means I've ground a little bit. So I'm doing this side flat, this side with a very narrow bevel. And then the last thing, probably most important, is that I want to strop it. And if I'm doing a day's worth of grafting, I'll have my strop, which is just leather with honing compound on it. You can get that from a woodworking store, or there's also Jeweler's Rouge is also used for this, but I need to kind of have the edge of the table here. And you simply pull backwards away from the edge. If I go with the blade pointing forward, I'll cut into my strop. So I pull backwards against it. And that just polishes that cutting edge. Okay, so sometimes the honing compound will stick to that, and you want to wipe that off. But so that said, today you don't need to do this. because I think your knives came plenty sharp to do what you're going to do now. But if you continue this as a hobby, you should certainly purchase a good stone and a straw and make keep your, it's so much easier to keep your knife sharp than to sharpen it when it's dull.
Very important. I put this in the chat here, but I just want to let you know, it's clear that we won't get to all of the questions in this session, but Lindsay and Jen and I will go over these questions and we'll send out some responses to you via email. Probably next week is when we'll get to that. A couple more questions before we go that are pretty time sensitive. Lindsay, there's questions both about what if your scion wood and or rootstock has been frozen, if it is still viable, and also if it gets moldy, if it's still viable, and if there are ways to prevent those things as well.
Yeah, the mold is mostly a temperature thing. If it got too warm, it could mold, but usually that fungus doesn't start until it's 60 degrees or more. So that's the whole idea of throwing this stuff in the refrigerator. And at fridge temperatures, you're not going to see mold in just a week or two. If it does have it now, I'd just simply rinse it off and put a clean, damp newspaper around it and restore it in the fridge. Frozen, if it's, I saw that chat, if it's lightly frozen, yes, actually somebody sent me some scion woods here and I grafted some trees this morning that had been a little bit, there was a little frost around one end of them. They just spent the whole winter out there on the tree, and they can stand a light freezing. Now, put them in the deep freeze. Technically, yes, they can be brought back from that, but it's best not to push your luck. So if they have a little frost on them, that's not going to hurt. I would maybe just submerge them in cold water to warm them back up.
So I did get a private message from someone who realized that their fridge wasn't working. There were actually ice crystals and both ends of the bags were frozen solid. And I think the question there is whether those could still be worked with and survive or not.
Again, I would bring them, I would thaw them out slowly. Leave them in their wrapper and set them in a cool place and so they thaw out slowly. That should work.
Great. Yeah, let's see. I think it's probably time we should just let people know that we will be sending out more information. We've recorded this session, and next week I'll have that recording available and send that out to you as well. We'll also make sure that you have Lindsay's contact information and Jen's contact information, and we really want to stay connected to you. So please don't be shy about, writing an email and asking questions. We want you to succeed, and we want to stay connected with you. So any last thoughts, Lindsay?
Well, certainly you have scion wood to practice with, and I would say I would just get your knife out and practice with most of that. Maybe save one piece for when you're in your breakout session with our coaches, and that should it's really a simple cut. It's just you need to do it a few times. I want you to do it a few times before you tackle the real thing. So whittle that stuff up, make a new tip on it with an 8-foot stem that you have in there. You should be able to make at least a half a dozen nice cuts on that until you have hardly enough to hold on to. And again, you can always go out the door and tackle your shrubbery and find more wood to play with. But it really does, the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll get with it and the more accurate you'll be with your cuts. So yes, carry on, and we will be excited to see you in our breakout sessions, and I'll see you this afternoon with the further tree care. You saw just a little bit about what to do with these things immediately when you've made your grafts. In this afternoon session, we're going to kind of touch on that again, but then we're going to go through the first 3 or 4 years of the tree's life with you. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, and hope to see you in the next sessions.